James Mueller's former boss, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, officially resigning. He just sent his resignation letter and will leave the Department of Justice May 11th. And this comes as a legal showdown is looming today. House Democrats escalating the pressure on Attorney General Bill Barr to testify this week. Barr now threatening to skip Thursday's testimony on the Mueller report before the Judiciary Committee. Barr now objecting to Chairman Nadler's plan to have committee lawyers question him. Barr's office saying, quote, the Attorney General agreed to appear before Congress. Therefore, members of Congress should be the ones doing the questioning. Chairman Nadler speaking out today and getting blunt. They will subpoena Barr if they have to.
If the Attorney General is afraid to subject himself to questions where you can follow up, well, that may indicate lack of confidence in his own position. And more to the point, we have to get to the bottom of these issues. That's why we've called him in. And it's not up to the Attorney General to tell the committee how to conduct his business. If he doesn't show up on Thursday, we'll have to go to subpoenas.
Chairman Nadler telling Barr he does not get to pick how the committee questions him. And there are growing questions about how specifically Barr handled the Mueller report, specifically clearing Trump on obstruction of justice. A Democratic member of the House Judiciary Committee calling Barr, quote, a paid federal public defender for President Trump. Former Deputy AG Sally Yates saying if Trump was not president, he would likely be charged.
I've been a prosecutor for nearly 30 years, and I can tell you I've personally prosecuted obstruction cases on far, far less evidence than this. And yes, I believe if he were not the president of the United States, he would likely be indicted on obstruction.
Joining me now, NYU law professor Melissa Murray and former federal prosecutor, my dear friend Joyce Vance. Melissa, to you first. It's not a surprise, but your thoughts specifically on Rod Rosenstein resigning today and sending that very complimentary letter to President Trump.
Well, my first thought was whether President Trump had written this resignation letter himself. It was incredibly complimentary, but this is not unheard of. It's certainly not unheard of for this administration, where there's been a revolving door of people coming in or out. The real question is how was it that Rod Rosenstein was able to last as long as he did? 2 years, a pretty long tenure in this administration.
Well, maybe he did because he was singing the tune President Trump wanted him to. Joyce, your thoughts? I mean, for Rod Rosenstein to sort of close the letter with a wink and a nod, thanks for always putting America first. We know that's President Trump's jam.
You know, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein is certainly speaking the president's language in this letter, his closeout letter with the administration. Often, though, federal officials, when they're resigning, are provided with some sort of a template or a form, and the expectation is that they'll follow along with that. We don't know if that's the case here, and certainly Rod Rosenstein could have said whatever he wanted to say in his resignation letter. This makes it pretty clear that he resigns as someone who was firmly in the president's camp during his service.
Well, someone else who appears to be firmly in President Trump's camp is Bill Barr. That is why Congress wants to talk to him, specifically the Judiciary Committee. What actually happens if Barr skips the hearing? I mean, we can talk about what he should do, what is precedent, but it's like Real World MTV. What happens when they stop being polite and start getting real? He doesn't have to be polite.
No, he doesn't have to be polite. He can refuse to attend. Congress can then turn and use their enforcement powers, contempt, to be able to subpoena him to come in. But again, usually this goes back and forth as a kind of negotiation between Congress and the DOJ, and that can be really protracted, which dulls some of the momentum that the Democrats are hoping to get out of this entire process. They want to use this to gear up for what might be an impeachment investigation, and Barr basically can stonewall them on this by refusing to appear and make it a lot harder and eventually perhaps kick this to the courts.
So back and forth is exactly what President Trump or maybe Bill Barr is looking for, running the clock. It's what the president did with regard to releasing his taxes on the campaign trail. You'll get them, you'll see them, I promise. And then he wins, and Kellyanne Conway straight out of the gate. Well, that issue's been litigated. Nobody cares. President Trump won. That seems to be the agenda here. Is it going to work, Joyce?
You know, it's an interesting question because this president really is a master of kicking the can down the road and hoping he won't face consequences until some point in the distant future, if ever. But the neutral arbiter here will be the federal court system. And one wonders if the federal courts might not reach a point where they say enough is enough. It's not as though Bill Barr has a legitimate reason here for not showing up to testify. He's just saying the executive branch objects to the way that the legislative branch is conducting its business. There's no constitutional basis for saying that. We may find a federal judge who decides that this attorney general needs to show up in court, or rather show up in Congress.
The non-experts out there have said, well, listen, Bill Barr has said he will sit down, he will answer Congress's questions, but the issue is staff lawyers. And Jerry Nadler explained why he thinks it's so important for staff counsel to do those follow-up questions.
We will decide what the most effective way of asking questions are, and that's what our decision is. We've seen many witnesses filibuster for 4.5 minutes and then give a non-responsive answer in the last half minute, and then you can't follow up because the next questioner may have a different question in mind. So enabling staff counsel to question the witness for half an hour makes it much more effective at getting the answers.
Your thoughts?
Well, I've testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I think Chairman Nadler is exactly right. The oscillating 5 minutes back and forth makes it really hard to develop a line of questioning and to follow up and really elicit the kind of information that would be helpful if you are trying to mount an impeachment investigation. So sending this over to professional lawyers who can actually sit on this for about 30 minutes it seems to be a more productive avenue, but that's exactly what the president does not want.
So there you go. It seems to be more productive, Joyce. We know that Christine Blasey Ford underwent that when she testified, and she has a lot less experience than Bill Barr does. But realistically speaking, could Democrats be overplaying their hand here?
You know, I don't think that they are overplaying their hand. I think what they're going to create is a picture of an attorney general who is frankly frightened to face professional questioning. Everyone knows that Congressman Nadler has amassed a very competent, qualified, experienced legal staff. Any of those people would be well qualified to question the attorney general. And this is a sitting attorney general. This, as you point out, is not someone who's never faced questioning before. If he cannot defend his behavior and the administration's reaction to the Mueller report for 30 minutes, then he should be ashamed. It is his obligation to appear in front of Congress and to answer the questions this committee poses in whatever form they choose to pose them.
Joyce, it's pretty tough to be ashamed at a time of shamelessness. I want to share a bit of Hillary Clinton herself reading the Mueller report. To me, if this doesn't turn into a podcast, I don't know what should. Take a look at this.
The investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally. The president slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh my God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I
mean, that is better than celebrities reading mean tweets about them. Is it too soon? I mean, that's amazing, but is it too soon to be joking about this, given the context of the Mueller report and how so much of it has been mischaracterized and so many people around the country don't really know what's in there?
Well, maybe it's not too soon for Hillary Clinton, who really is sort of the person who has benefited the least from all of this. But it is interesting to have it read by someone who was so invested in it, and it does take on the sort of so hurt by it. It takes on this sort of level of high drama, but this is what we're living in. I just spent the whole last week in Spain, and as we went from site to site, they kept talking about the rise of Franco and the rise of nationalism, and honestly, it sounded a lot like what we're seeing here in the United States. So for me, it seemed incredibly familiar, and you know, there's a precedent here that we ought to be mindful of.
It's also a reminder, though, everyone who says Trump did this to us, how did we get here? The rise of populism is all over the world.
Yes.
Trump's just one part of it. Melissa, Joyce, thank you so much. You know I love kicking off any show with some smart women. And let's continue on that trail. I want to bring in Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is a member of the Judiciary Committee. Congressman, I want to start with Rod Rosenstein's letter of resignation. It says that he is grateful to Trump for, quote, the opportunity to serve and for the courtesy and humor he displays in their personal conversations. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, I think that he was very disappointing, especially the way that he handled things at the end with Barr standing behind him as he had the press conference. So it'll be interesting to see whether he comes before our committee and what he has to say now that he will not be an employee of the Department of Justice.
All right, let's turn to Bill Barr. If he's not acting in good faith, if you're in a position where you are dependent on good faith and appropriate behavior, what can you possibly do about it? I mentioned it before, tongue-in-cheek, but we are living in a time when there is no shame.
Exactly. There is no shame, and this administration has conducted itself with a complete disregard to the rule of law. And so what my concern is that we issue a subpoena, he ignores the subpoena. We go to court, he gets a court order and ignores that. I think that would really be a problem. But his refusal to come before our committee because he doesn't want to be questioned by outside attorneys, there's absolute precedent for that. So that is not the reason to refuse to come. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this is going to be the general behavior of this administration.
Well, it seems at this point that that is going to be the general behavior. You clearly want the staff lawyers to be asking questions. If that option is not available to you, if Barr is saying my way or the highway, or I'll see you with a subpoena, what are you going to do?
Well, I think it's going to be really important for us to take this through the process completely, because we can't allow the precedent to be set that when we call someone before our committee, that they then want to define how their appearance is going to be on those terms. So I think it's very important that we take a stand. But you know, the other thing that I think is so important during this process is that we have to make sure that we educate the U.S. public as to what is going on, because the president's narrative, of course, is presidential harassment, because there has been no oversight and investigation in the first 2 years of his presidency. It's important for the public to understand that this is our constitutional duty, our constitutional responsibility. The checks and balances on the administration is the way our government works. But we do know that the commander-in-chief has very little understanding and very little regard for the institution.
But he's not alone. There's a whole lot of Republicans as well who know all about the three separate and equal branches of government, but they're standing with the president here, are they not?
Well, not only that, I mean, they also spent the first 2 years not doing their constitutional duty. I think that's absolutely right. But at a certain point in time, when the U.S. public gets tired of this, and when it's actually compromising their ability to get elected, I won't be surprised at all if they abandon him. You know, we know that the reason why the Attorney General held that press conference was so he could set the narrative and really to dissuade people from actually reading the report.
Okay, but the issue is, Congresswoman, he may have had bad intentions, but he was successful in getting the outcome that he wanted, wasn't he?
Well, I don't say he was successful just yet. I think time will tell. We are going to have these hearings with or without the witnesses, but I am hopeful that they will comply. And whether they are there or not, it's really incumbent upon all of us in Congress, all of the Democrats and the Republicans that are willing to take the American public through this process so they understand exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.